Dr. Mendoza. Hello everyone, and thank you all for coming here today. My name is Anusha Kumar, and I'm one of the PAMSA co-chairs. So PAMSA stands for Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association. And along with my fellow speaker board chair Navika and the rest of the PAMSA and the Center of Excellence, I'm delighted to introduce our 2017 Pfeiffer visiting scholar, Dr. Dora Wang. So, Dr. Wang comes to us from the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, where she's a clinical associate professor in psychiatry and a medical historian. Though she's flown in from afar, Dr. Wang describes herself as a Californian at heart. She spent the majority of
So glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. So she spent the majority of her childhood in the Los Angeles San Gabriel Valley before heading to Yale for medical school. She then returned to California for her residency at UCLA, and she also completed a master's in English literature at Berkeley. So it's clear that Dr. Wang wears many hats, and of note is her role as an author. Her memoir, which is actually right here, is titled The Kitchen Shrink, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer. In it, she reflects on changes in the US healthcare system and their impact on patients' health, the doctor-patient relationship, and physicians' identity and well-being. Her writing balances the quiet thoughtfulness of her patient interactions with the energy of her research and conclusions. It's definitely a worthwhile read. So today, Dr. Wang's talk will touch upon disparities in Asian American mental health, wherein she will discuss the implications of our current medical system. Timely issue. But I'll leave it to her to tell you all the details. So thank you again for attending, and welcome, Dr. Wang.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Alicia. It's such an honor to be here, so thank you, PAMSA, thank you, Center of Excellence, thank you, Dr. Mendoza, Mark, and Stanford. Such an honor to be a psychiatrist and author from New Mexico here at Stanford. In any case, so well, it's another day and another vote in Congress about healthcare reform. And one of my purposes today, so I'll be talking about healthcare reform, a history of American medicine, and also about how a lot of physicians are using technology to take leadership these days of the direction of American medicine, as well as healthcare reform, and that a lot of these physicians are actually Asian American. So, timely topic for Asian Pacific Heritage Month. I also just want to encourage everybody to be involved somehow in healthcare reform, because healthcare really affects each one of us personally, professionally, financially, and that and I'll be providing a lot of key information about the history. And I think once you hear this, it'll be obvious that healthcare system will not be fixed until physicians are back in the driver's seat. Physicians and our values. And American medicine is, who says driverless cars don't exist? It's a driverless car right now. I'll talk, a lot of this lecture is based on a publication of mine in Psychiatric Annals. And I'll talk about how physicians took charge of the American medical system early in the 1900s. And this set up the stage for a golden age for American medicine and for America itself. And I believe this is no coincidence. A lot of us don't know that in the 1980s, this nation made a very conscious decision that the healthcare system would be in the for-profit sector, that healthcare of Americans would be for profit. This was a this was a decision that did not go through Congress, was not debated. It was just decided upon by the administration at that time. So unlike Obamacare, the ACA, or the repeal of the ACA that was voted upon today, this key decision in the 1980s that healthcare should be for profit went through no vote of Congress. And so in contrast, the healthcare different from healthcare reform in the last century. So in the last century, physicians really took control, and I think we need to do that again right now. But in the last century, they took control and actually put the values of physicians in the center of the healthcare system. And I just want to say that we can't wait for Congress or health insurance executives to provide the leadership to fix our healthcare system, that it needs to be physicians, our values, and we who practice the ancient art of caring for the sick. Nothing will be right, not medical care, not the values of the nation, not the economy, until physicians are back in the driver's seat of American medicine. Today, much of the world is being remade by technology, and medical care is no exception. This poses an unprecedented opportunity for physicians to get back in the driver's seat of healthcare. The past few weeks I've been preparing slides for this lecture, and I wanted to end with examples of physicians who are using technology to change the face of medicine, to lead healthcare reform. And it was only in the process of putting together these slides that I realized, oh my goodness, a lot of them are Asian American. So I'll be also talking about how Asian Americans are at the forefront of remaking American medicine through technology, and that Asian Americans are at the forefront of healthcare reform today, actually. So in honor of Asian Pacific Heritage Month, I thought I'd start with some slides about my own family. And I'm reminded of Chiang Kai-shek Memorial that I visited in Taipei. And even though it's his memorial, the first room is dedicated to his mother. And so it's very Asian value to remember your ancestors. And along that lines, here's the oldest photo in my family from 1930s China. And this is my mother, the little girl on the floor, and her brother, and her grandmother and aunts, my mother's family. So immigration is at the very foundation of America and of Asian America. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that started in 1882 and went on into the 1940s and wasn't completely repealed until the 1960s, my family immigrated to Brazil. So this is my grandfather. He was a general on the side of the Nationalist Army in China. And then when China became communist, he had to get out of China. And even though he worked for the United States government, he was a CIA agent, he worked for Harry Truman, he was not allowed to immigrate to the United States because of Chinese exclusion. So that's why my family went to Brazil, and where I was born, and why my name is Dora, which is a common Brazilian name. So in the 1960s, immigration laws changed and were no longer based on national origin. So my family moved from Brazil and eventually settled in the San Gabriel Valley of Los Angeles, where they live and where my grandma's now 105. So I grew up not in Taipei, but in Little Taipei as an Asian American. And when I was growing up, there were only 2 Chinese restaurants in Monterey Park, and there were so few Asians that my mother was actually the Spanish-English librarian at the local public library. And as the Asian immigrants started arriving, she showed kung fu movies at the library, she bought Asian American books, and it became the first Asian Pacific public library collection in the country. I grew up in that, spending a lot of time with her in that library. And so I liked the psychiatry section. So when I was 10, actually, I decided I would be a psychiatrist and a writer. So my invitation for this lecture is because Anusha read The Kitchen Shrink. And my publisher thought it was a significant enough book to nominate it for awards. In any case, how do I make this down? Okay. at some point I realized that there have been a lot of changes in American medicine. And part of how I realized this was in 2002, I was chief of the psychiatry consult service at University of New Mexico Hospital. There was a patient there. She was 19, she needed a liver transplant to live. And the insurance company decided that she didn't deserve a liver transplant. And it just struck me as a young physician at the time, why is it the insurance company that's deciding, not her family, or her doctors? And so at Berkeley, when I studied English there, I liked the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. And it can be described as, okay, an Indian restaurant moves into your neighborhood, you should be able to read the whole history of the world from some event like that. So from my feelings about my patient who died under those circumstances, I wrote The Kitchen Shrink, which is actually a history of the American healthcare system, changes that have happened through my personal perspective as a physician and psychiatrist. So a lot of changes have happened. The medical profession has become the healthcare industry. Psychiatry once healed through the doctor-patient relationship, and I used to call it, it used to heal through the doctor-patient relationship only, but now it's mostly about pharmacotherapy. And a study out of Columbia University indicated that only 1 in 10 psychiatrists offer anything aside from pharmacotherapy these days. But I think that human health and emotions are now looked at as products to be processed in the most cost-efficient, profitable manner. And it's a new kind of industrialization, not of cars, burgers, or phones, but of people. And has American medicine become an assembly line for the processing of the human soul? Okay, so as I was mentioning, the decision that American medicine should be run for corporate profit was a decision that came in the 1980s with no vote from Congress. And here, so I blogged about it and stuff. And many of us recall when the American medical system centered on humanistic values. When I was a medical student, financial concerns seemed beneath the noble goals of the medical profession. It was actually not good to talk about money. You just did whatever you could for the patient. And hospitals and clinics, as we all remember, used to be named for saints, and they were run by charities and community organizations. And actually, courts across the country ruled that corporate profit in medical care was, quote unquote, against sound public policy. But now healthcare is one of Wall Street's most profitable industries, and insurance companies hold the purse strings on medical decisions. And I know that whenever I see a patient or prescribe medications, the insurance company has to approve of it first. And it's very sad that around the country, even charitable hospitals with over 150 years of history have closed, because if they're providing care for free and the other hospitals are making the money, they can't stay open. So St. Vincent in Manhattan, that cared for survivors of the Titanic, the Medical College of Pennsylvania, which once graduated a female student who was born a slave, these charitable institutions have closed after 150 years. Okay. Yet the nation's medical system has had charitable beginnings. And this was Benjamin Franklin, who founded the nation's first medical hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751 to care for the sick, poor, and insane wandering the streets of Philadelphia. And so the origins of hospitals in this country actually had to do with mental health and with caring for the sick and the poor. If you look at the Merriam-Webster online dictionary, even to this day, the definition of hospital is, first, a charitable institution for the needy, aged, infirm, or young. So those are the roots of the medical system, is to care for the sick and charitable purposes. Let's see, I'll skip this one. So in the early you know what, this is not my presentation. Oh geez, yeah, no wonder. Let's see, I guess I could, yeah, I think oh well, I'll just, oh, yeah, it's okay, it's okay. So medical care only got to be useful in the 1950s and 60s. So around 1900, medical care was not even useful. You know, it's had a limited utility. And as one example is that in 1918, 2% of the world population died of the flu. Okay, so medical care was not even that useful in the early 1900s, yet a massive healthcare reform effort occurred. And the legacy of that effort is you know, we still live with the legacy of that effort now. The FDA was founded in 1906 to protect the public. The fact that physicians have prescribing rights, it came out of that healthcare reform effort. And a lot of other countries, you don't need a prescription to get medications. You just go to the drugstore and buy whatever you want. But more importantly, physicians and the ethics of physicians were put at the center of American healthcare. We all know the terms snake oil and quack, and I call these terms cultural memories of this era of healthcare reform. And this is why healthcare needed to be reformed. Cocaine, tooth drops for pain, instantaneous cure for pain, asthma, cigarettes, yeah, cannabis, indica. I mean, it kind of makes me think that right now you have medical marijuana dispensaries popping up all over the place, yet there's not a lot of evidence that it helps much. Snake oil was sold, and sometimes it didn't even contain snake oil. The term quack comes from medicine men who would arrive into town and very loudly, quackingly, I guess, sell their cures. And they were usually traveling salespeople because they would get chased out of town after people discovered that their cures were fraudulent, or after people spent their money and there was no more money to be made, so they would move on. So healthcare reform in the last century also happened for economic reasons. Okay. Scientific discoveries actually, I think they may eventually help the health of people, but initially they actually make patients more vulnerable. And for example, the germ theory was discovered in the 1800s by scientists like Koch-Lister, Pasteur, but it was not useful for another 70 years or so. So you had the germ theory in the 1880s or so, and it wasn't until the 1930s that antibiotics and vaccines were discovered, and it wasn't until the 1950s until it was manufactured in enough quantity to be helpful or impactful. Yeah. So even though it took about 70 years or so for the germ theory to actually be translated into usefulness in medical care, profiteers were out there right away capitalizing on it. And one of them was William Radom, who was this Texan who had 17 factories in several states selling his microbe killer, because there was all this hype that we found the cause of disease. And so he had a microbe killer. It says cures all diseases. The ingredients were mainly water, red wine, some acids. And so once again, the main harm was economic harm.
Where do you see that happening now? Maybe in the realm of psychiatry especially?
Well, actually, where I see it happening now is in the realm of technology. There are 250,000 apps, healthcare apps out there. There are 10,000 psychiatry mental health apps, and these are available to anybody with a smartphone or online access. By contrast, half of U.S. counties have not one single mental health practitioner. And so when you just look at those facts, I think we're underestimating apps and technology and how important they're going to be. And so right now people are buying apps, and there's a lot of hype. Lumosity was fined $2 million for false advertising and for actually delaying the treatment of people with dementia because they were, doing Lumosity games instead of actually seeing their doctors. So I think right now, with what's happening with apps, that's very similar to this. And so I think there are lessons to be learned in history. Thanks for asking questions. It makes it it makes it better. Okay. So in the so there were the quacks and the medicine men, but doctors themselves, their cures were actually not much better. Leeches, bloodletting. These two doctors, a surgeon in the United States and Alfred Hager, a surgeon in Germany, they were doing ovarectomies as a cure for hysteria. So if you remember, hystera is the Greek word for uterus. And Aristotle in ancient Greece said that mental illness was caused by the uterus becoming unanchored and wandering. And so actually this wandering uterus theory of mental illness proceeded for almost 2,000 years. And even into the 1800s, and the reason these surgeons on two continents were removing ovaries was for the reason of curing mental illness. But only because this happened was it discovered that ovaries govern menstruation. So this is a really important discovery in medical care, and it happened because of this. So this was the state of doctors and our profession in the late 1800s. Here's another example of the medical profession not being that different from the quacks in terms of the treatments they offered. So Joseph McDowell Matthews, who at one point was president of the AMA, he had a book, How to Succeed in the Practice of Medicine, published 1905, and he listed the contents of a physician's saddlebag, the typical contents: calamine, opium, quinine, buchu, ipecac, Dover's powder, constitute his armamentarium. And back then, they still had this kind of humoral theory of disease, that disease was caused by bad humors, and you had to let out blood, you had to make a patient have diarrhea or purge them of bad humors. So so what was it that differentiated the quacks and the snake oil salesmen from physicians? What was it? I mean, it wasn't, I would say it was not their treatments. I think what the difference was a physician's code of ethics. And the physician's code of ethics, so this is a 12th century manuscript of the Hippocratic Oath. So Hippocrates lived in like 400 BC or so. And the code of ethics that he wrote is still what medical students take today, what I took when I graduated from med school. So why has this code of ethics survived the millennia, survived thousands of years, when for most of this time, medical care was not even useful? I would say because when we are sick or when somebody we know is sick or dying, we are really vulnerable. And so I think a difference between doctors and the quacks is that doctors protect patients. So here are key elements of the Hippocratic Oath: to hold him who has taught me this art as equal to parents, and to live my life in partnership with him, to share instruction with those who have signed this covenant, but no one else. There's an element of secrecy here. To keep the sick from harm and injustice, to come for the benefit of the sick, and to not commit mischief. Confidentiality. So basically, the physicians' codes of ethics are time-tested methods of protecting patients over millennia. You know, right now we have the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, but you know, I think that it falls short of this, which is time-tested over millennia, and this is another reason why I think physicians need to be in charge, physicians in our ethics. These ethics of do no harm, to put the patient's interests before one's own, to practice with compassion, to conduct a doctor-patient relationship with confidentiality without mischief, and that doctors should serve only others who believe in these principles. So in the early 1900s, doctors did not serve corporations because they did not believe in these principles. So I would say that more than antibiotics, more than surgery, more than the cures that doctors offer, I think what we mostly offer is this code of ethics. So in the early 1900s, the AMA took action to put these principles at the center of American medicine. And here are some of the things that they did, and I think we should learn from this because we need to do this again. So the AMA was founded in 1847, and by the 1900s, its membership grew so that it actively took on healthcare reform. And it demanded that the proprietary medicine industry respond to the ethics of medicine. They did a lot of things, but one key thing they did was they said they gave drug companies a choice to advertise to the public or physicians, but not to both. And so this actually continued into the 1990s until the FAA released, they changed this. And so now we have drugs advertised to the public again on TV, even antipsychotics with all the side effects that they have. I can't believe they're advertised to the public. In 1905, the AMA founded the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, and so physicians took it upon themselves to test and evaluate drugs. And they published their results in this publication called New and Non-Official Remedies. And once again, they refused to endorse any drug that was advertised to the public because they wanted to protect patients. Basically, patients are really vulnerable. If your mother or yourself are sick or dying and this medicine man comes to town and promises you'll get better, who wouldn't spend their last dime? Okay. And the 1905 minutes of on the AMA website, you can look in their archives now and look back at the minutes from long time ago. And from the minutes it says, the most important and effective measure ever undertaken by this association to rid the profession of the abuse of the nostrum evil. They didn't parse words. They were not polite. We're going to get rid of these tonic salespeople. Okay. So they also they collaborated with journalists. So the muckraker journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams, he investigated over 200 companies and individuals by name, He listed the names of people who had died, who should have been cured if the promises were true of these drug companies. And the AMA actually printed and distributed 150,000 copies of his book, The Great American Fraud. They pressured President Roosevelt, and because of pressure from physicians, journalists, and the public, including Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, Roosevelt passed the Food and Drug Act of 1906. And the FDA at that time became a government agency that tested medications. But even before that, physicians were doing it themselves. So it's an example of doctors taking leadership and then the government following, which is the opposite of what's happening now. Yeah.
Just to clarify, prior to that, patients got their medications from separate, or the doctor would write the prescription, it was the patient's bonus to get the medication, or how did that change?
Well, I think it's kind of like apps today. The patients can just go and get, what they wanted. Even if you go to, I think, France, Germany, Mexico, you just walk into a drugstore and you just get whatever medication you want. There's no regulation. So in the United States, the reason why patients need a prescription to see before they get a drug is because of this healthcare reform effort. And without this, patients are vulnerable. It's like the medicine man comes to town and says, "You've got a cough, take this," and they have no judgment. They don't understand. So doctors really just took control to protect patients. And a lot of these protections are still here today. So this is our legacy. This is how we got to be where we are today. The physicians exerted a lot of pressure on corporations. So the early 1900s was an era of industrialization. I read my daughter the nursery rhyme, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all those craftsmen are gone. Those products are manufactured by corporations, assembly line style. But Paul Starr, who is a medical historian who wrote Social Transformation of American Medicine, he talks about how doctors, I guess, are smarter and resisted this kind of coming under corporate control. So doctors did things like, well, the 1934 AMA proceedings said, for a physician to allow a profit to be made from his work is, quote, beneath the dignity of professional practice, unfair competition with the profession, harmful to the profession of medicine and the welfare of people, and is against sound public policy. In the early 1900s, the Chicago Medical Society exerted pressure, and they excluded the Sears Roebuck physician from membership because he worked for a corporation. And so under that kind of pressure, this physician resigned. And it's so interesting that today, fast forward to today, almost all physicians work for insurance companies or some kind of big corporation. Okay. So there was something called the corporate practice of medicine doctrine that physicians put forth, that they, so in almost every state across the country, the AMA put pressure on the judicial system and the corporate practice to keep corporations out of medical care. And the corporate practice of medicine doctrine basically said corporations cannot engage in the practice of medicine because they cannot be licensed to practice medicine. And there are lots of rulings in many states that state this. It also said that corporations cannot employ physicians, and that commercialism in medicine violated sound public policy. So physicians were putting pressure on the government, on the tonic industry, and on the courts too. Okay. Physicians also got involved in controlling medical education, of course, and the 1913 AMA Council on Medical Education recommended that commercialism be driven out of graduate and undergraduate medical education, which is why a lot of medical schools to this day don't allow drug salesmen on campus. So these are all things physicians did. So because of physicians and the American Medical Association, profit making was banished as a motive in medicine. So when I was growing up, we had the term ambulance chaser, which was anybody who tried to profit off the illness or misfortune of the sick. So this was considered a bad term, ambulance chaser. But now it seems to be very commonplace that profit is made in healthcare. But this whole banishing of profit making and corporations, banishing that out of medical care really served doctors, and it protected the profession of medicine. So it was a golden age for American medicine and for America itself, and I would argue that this is not coincidental. Okay. Then modern medicine occurred. By the 1940s, you had a cure for tuberculosis. By the 1950s, antibiotics were being mass produced. And so finally, in the 1950s, medical care was considered useful by most people. And so finally, we had a lot. So it's interesting that medical care has, there's been the oath of Hippocrates, there was healthcare reform, but medical care has really only been very useful for about 60 years. So I think that's why we are seeing these heated debates and fights around healthcare, is because it's finally useful. People have always been vulnerable and always have been in need of protection, to the point where the ethics of physicians were always really important. But now it's actually even useful. So I think healthcare reform is going to be our entire future. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, medical care became undoubtedly useful. So that's why Medicare was created in 1964. One of the reasons being, the stated reasons, that it would be inhumane for people to not have access to medical care anymore, for reasons of social equity. Okay. My mom was a librarian, and that's why I became a psychiatrist and a writer. My dad was an econ professor. So I actually like economics, and I feel happy when I read about economics in economics journals. So this is the birth of healthcare economics. It came from one single paper called Uncertainty in the Welfare Economics of Medical Care. And actually, in this paper, I think this is the best paper I've ever read on the doctor-patient relationship. And it's an economics paper, which is very interesting. But it's written by Kenneth Arrow. And this single article created the entire field of healthcare economics. Also, the economics of information, which is another field of study. And Kenneth Arrow received this 1970 Nobel Prize in economics. So what did this paper say? He started with the question, if healthcare is so valuable, arguably more valuable than gold, why is so much of it provided for free? This was in the 1960s. So he basically said, how did zero pricing evolve for this? He decided that medical care is unique as a product and that the free market doesn't apply, that it's not like most products. For one thing, the stakes are different. The stakes are very low if you choose one soda or another, or one operating car versus another car that runs. The stakes in medical care are life or death. These are just different stakes than grocery shopping. Also, the customer cannot test the product before consuming it. You can't test what that cardiac surgery is going to be like. You can't test that tumor removal. And then also, sometimes we're too sick to make the decision. A couple of months ago, I was in a car accident, and I had surgery on my arm here, and I was unconscious when a lot of the decisions were made. I mean, I was rushed to the nearest hospital. I had no time to shop, and so that's another reason why healthcare is just not. It's not like other products. And then what he said was the information possessed by the physician as to the consequences and possibilities of treatment is necessarily very much greater than that of the patient. So in other words, the reason we go to see a doctor, or the reason we seek healthcare, is because of their knowledge. Without the knowledge of an educated physician, a physician has to go through so much education and then so much experience. And Kenneth Arrow said that if the patient could make the medical decision, the patient would have to be a doctor in order to know enough to make this decision. So therefore, the field of the economics of information was born out of this paper. And then he said patients have to trust their doctors because of this inherent knowledge inequality, because when you're sick, you're vulnerable to fear and hope. And also, sickness often disables your thinking, such as in mental illness, or if you're having a stroke or a coma. And he just says medical care is a unique product and the free market doesn't apply. And so that's why that's why professional codes of ethics exist. And that's why, so he said that if left to the free market, patients will in time demand protections because they can't possibly make these decisions. And he said patient protections have evolved over the millennia from ancient times, such as the oaths of the profession, to modern times, including educational requirements, licensing. And he also said profit just doesn't work in medical care because the patient has to trust the physician. The patient can never know as much as the physician. And so trust is really important, and profit is a signal that denies the trust relationship. So, any case, shortly after he got the Nobel Prize for this paper, healthcare was put into the for-profit sector. Richard Nixon actually believed in universal health care. So in 1970, healthcare was 7.2% of the GDP. And he actually said things like, across the nation, the average cost of a day of hospital care now exceeds $110. We have to do something about this. Without adequate health care, no one can make full use of his or her talents and opportunities. Okay. So he proposed universal health insurance. And what we call Obamacare today is actually a version of this. Comprehensive health insurance through the employer, government, Medicare. But then Watergate happened. Congressman Wilbur Mills was found with a stripper. Scandal. So the dream of universal health care coverage was lost until President Obama. That was hotly debated in Congress. But then Ronald Reagan became president in 1980. And without any debate or vote in Congress, American medicine was just put into the for-profit sector. And so the Health and Human Services Department was founded, and they held seminars across the country encouraging Wall Street and for-profit businesses to get into healthcare. I was an intern in Health and Human Services at that time in Washington, and I remember all this. And also funding to medical schools stopped. The business magazines had a field day. They loved it. They said, we're going to unleash free market forces to attack problems of cost and accessibility of healthcare. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for investment bankers. Forbes magazine says Healthcare Corporation of America dispenses his healthcare as profitably as KFC did drumsticks, and they were, yeah.
I was just curious whether, I guess, like, his healthcare reform was maybe a response or maybe predicted like an AIDS crisis.
You mean Nixon's
Reagan's.
or Reagan's? Whether they predicted the AIDS?
Or predicted, or I guess, like, just, yeah.
I think AIDS, I don't think there was
Was AIDS yet at that time, in the early 80s. I think AIDS came later. I mean, it's been around longer than that, but I think it did not become an epidemic until the 1990s. Okay, so Paul Starr got the 1984 Pulitzer Prize for this book, and he said, he warned everybody, the medical care of Americans now seems headed for control by conglomerates whose interests will be determined by the rate of return on investments. That is the future of where we're headed, and that's where we are now. Okay, so I'm just going to fast forward because of time. It's very sad that prior to Obamacare, 1 in 3 healthcare dollars went to administration or profit, because as Nobel Prize economist Paul Krugman said, America's healthcare system is designed to not pay. You know, there's denials, we have to get prior authorizations. And by contrast, and so Obamacare limits administration and profit to 20% of healthcare dollars. But in France, where there's no profit, administrative costs are 5%, Canada 6%, Taiwan 2%, and there's no profit allowed, and their administrative costs are this, compared to the US, where we had to have Obamacare to limit administration and profit to 20%. So I think when you look at that, all other efforts to save money in healthcare just pale. You know, when you think that 1 in 5 dollars or 1 in 3 healthcare dollars is going to profit and administration. Okay, so charitable hospitals have closed. Okay. So here's my Psychiatric Annals article, which is, so I predict that the ACA is going to fail because if you just look at history, it's not going to be complete until the ethics of physicians are at the center of medical care again. History tells us that reform is mandated not by the usefulness of medical care, but by the intrinsic vulnerability of human beings when sick or facing mortality. And the physicians' codes of ethics serve humanitarian functions, but I think they also serve economic functions. Simply because when we're sick, we'll spend every last dime we have. And so if the healthcare system is needing to increase profits every quarter, and you've got vulnerable patients willing to spend every last dime that they have, it just seems like a setup for a failing economy. All nations with advanced economies have healthcare systems that are not for profit. The United States is the only first world nation that has the medical care of its citizens in the for-profit sector. And I think that there's that's not a coincidence either. I think that the way if things continue the way they are now, we're going to become a third world country. Okay. So I think healthcare reform is far from complete, and it won't be complete until the age-old ethics of physicians are restored to the center of American medicine. And let's see. Okay, I think I do have some. Here are some. So doctors kind of ignored when managed care and health insurance got into the picture. We didn't think of them as a real threat. Psychiatrists kind of ignored the rise of psychiatric drugs. They thought this will never replace therapy. And I think similarly, we cannot ignore the rise of technology right now and all the psychiatric apps that are not that useful now, but just give them time. So some people who are taking leadership right now, especially in issues of technology or using technology, are, for example, Steve Chan was a resident at UC Davis. John Toros was a resident at Harvard when the two of them started the Task Force for App Evaluation of the American Psychiatric Association. And so I applaud them as taking leadership. I think apps are going to be a huge deal, and it's residents who have taken leadership with this issue. Vivek Murthy was also a resident when he founded Doctors for America, which is now a health advocacy, healthcare reform organization. He was also a computer programmer, so he actually used technology to organize. Right now the membership is 16,000 people across 50 states. So he was a resident when he did this. And then here he is in the driver's seat of the Patients Over Politics bus tour that he organized. The executive director of Doctors for America is an Asian American woman, Alice Chen. And the president of Doctors for America is an Asian American woman, Mona Mangat. And here they are with Obama in his Oval Office. And Vivek Murthy got to be the 19th Surgeon General. Sanjeev Arora at University of New Mexico started Project ECHO. It's a way of spreading specialty care in underserved regions. Congress recently passed the ECHO bill based on his work. And so here's Project ECHO. It's a bunch of specialists in one room looking at a video screen, and rural and primary care doctors video conference in and get advice from the experts at the university. So Project ECHO is now worldwide now. The Army has adopted it. I work for Project ECHO sometimes. When Apple launched its first healthcare apps last year, 2 of the 4 apps were launched by this guy, Asian American guy, Mark Wang. His company is Glow, and it's, let's see, Glow Nurture, Glow Baby, help getting pregnant and tracking baby's progress. The data that they collect is just amazing. 4 million users, 300,000 couples around the world. So just the data that they are collecting is just so amazing. This is somebody who led the development of Taiwan's single-payer healthcare system. They have a great healthcare system that's based on US Medicare, and they have less than 2% overhead. He's an Asian American guy out of Harvard. Okay. So anyway, I was going to read from here, but I think we're short of time. I'd say get in there, change the world. There are people who were residents who have become Surgeon General over things that they did as a resident. And as I was saying over lunch today, the people leading healthcare right now are politicians, business people, and it just needs to be medical professionals and doctors. And so any one of you in this room, I think, would probably do a better job than what's being done now. And so doctors need to get in there and take this back for the sake of our profession, for this health of patients, and even for the sake of the country.
So what can physicians or anybody really do to push back against the insurance companies? Because they seem to be like the evil party in this case.
Well, so they just seem to grow. And I've been thinking about this. I don't think there is a concerted effort right now. But what physicians did in the early 1900s is that when they tested drugs, and that became a precursor to the FDA, maybe physicians now need to evaluate the health insurance companies. And maybe we need to publish publications like that Great American Fraud, of people who are paying premiums and not getting health care. I have a friend who sells health insurance, and I asked her when Obamacare happened, I said, well, what do you think of this? She says, well, okay, so we have universal health coverage. Everybody has health insurance. It doesn't mean that they're going to get health care. The insurance companies can still deny care. They can't deny you coverage, but they can still deny care.
So I guess along these lines, I'm interested in your thoughts about the efforts for single payer, the physician-led efforts that are going on. And yeah, the stuff you will remember. And also in the context of, it feels like we're outmanned and we're out-financed. So, doctors are busy seeing patients, and there are, it's the largest lobbying entity in Washington, D.C. It now outspends defense. And
Really? Health
yeah,
insurance?
yeah. Well, health insurance and pharmaceutical companies, and so many of the things that we do are turned into profit. And the amount that they're spending to influence the legislature is tremendous, and it does outspend defense. And I think an additional challenge, which I think is played out today, is in terms of making a moral stand. That apparently a large number of our politicians don't care about moral values. And so I think that's another challenge that we have, and it's a disconnect with their constituents. People care, like you call and you can't get through, but there's a tremendous disconnect, which I think is fueled by all that money. And so I think, another barrier is we have, the courts have allowed a lot of money to flood into the political process. And
So, great question. Are we so far gone? What can we possibly do now? Well, if we look at history, physicians got together and they decided they were not going to work for corporations. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. We're not going to let you work for Sears Roebuck. We're not going to. And so, I think just looking at history, one option would be physicians get together and say, we're not going to do this anymore. And if everybody agrees, then.
I think the challenge for patients when physicians have done that locally is, you get a lot of these concierge practices, which really only people with significant finances can access, and then everything else that they want to do, is going to go through an entity, and the price differential. So, I work in a setting where I was able to see the cost that a corporation is paying for labs, and it's actually like 2 orders of magnitude smaller than what I would pay. So my copay for any given lab is bigger than the actual cost of that lab if it's purchased by a corporation. Yeah. So there's been these huge differentials that are perpetuated that makes it really difficult for us to.
Yeah. So these are good questions.
I think we can't go backwards and fix what has already changed. I think we have to move forward in technology, like Dr. Sanjeev Arora, using video conferencing to decrease costs of healthcare and to increase access to specialty advice. I think we need to move forward in those kinds of directions. I think we don't know the answer yet, but I'm not optimistic we're going to undo what's been done. And I think the answer lies in the world is getting remade by technology. Right next door to you all, it's getting remade, and physicians have to get in there and be a part of this remaking, and that's an opportunity for us to take it back. I don't think we're going to go backwards and fix everything I just talked about. We just have to take control of the future. That's just my opinion.
Single payer is a possibility.
Single payer here. Well, a lot of like Canada has single payer, and England, but I think Germany doesn't. Switzerland doesn't, and
they have universal coverage.
Yeah,
so I guess the Medicare problem in terms of having universal coverage and how you parse that out, whether it's with or without insurance companies.
Yeah, I think the values of physicians have, that it needs to be for the sake of the patient and not for the sake of making money. I think those values have to be in there. And but I think there are also, I mean, I think it would be great if we had a single payer, and it would be efficient.
Taiwan has a single payer system that's based on US Medicare. And so if we can have one option would just be to argue that why don't we just adopt Taiwan's program? We'll automatically cut administrative costs from 20% to 2%. Yeah, so I don't know what the answer is.
So you spoke of this tension between technology being helpful to medicine but also harmful to patients. Excuse me. So I guess you're talking about how technology is becoming a more and more integrated component of healthcare in terms of these apps. So I guess I'm wondering, are your main concerns about apps in general regulation by physicians, and then also in what other ways do you see technology as being harmful or helpful to patients in terms of improving access to care or quality of care?
That's a great question. I think we're at the very beginning and we don't know. John Toros, whose picture I put up, he actually does, that's his academic career, is, studying apps and this whole new field, and he collaborates with Laura Roberts, your chair of psychiatry here. But anyway, so we don't know where it's going. I think currently the apps are largely not clinically based. Clinicians are not involved in making them. At the American Psychiatric Association has this little cohort that's encouraging clinicians to get more involved in developing the apps. I think John Toros did a study of mindfulness apps, and there were hundreds of mindfulness apps, but only 2 of them actually offered any mindfulness training, and the evidence for their effectiveness was not good. But I think physicians should get into app development. We should not ignore it as a fad. That I see parallels between the world of apps right now and pharmaceuticals in the early 1900s. So I just I encourage you all to get in there and take control of this new industry.
Are there any models that you see that maybe have both the patient first with some profitability in that? And I say that because there's a lot of risk involved in innovation. There's cost involved in innovation. How do you continue having an innovative culture, so to speak, without some profitability? It doesn't seem to me that would be a possibility. So are there any models that may have like a win-win where you have put the patient first, understand, but there is some profitability so that you can continue to have innovation inside?
Well, I mean, the government can fund research, and they support new industries. A lot of research is done is government supported, so that could be one model. Government used to support medical schools, and they cut that funding in 1980. So, yeah, I mean, what else is government supposed to be doing but trying to invest in the well-being and health care of the citizens.
But I guess along those lines, I mean, Kaiser's an interesting model, and they're sustaining, and they've done a tremendous amount of innovation, and they've developed a lot of chronic care pathways and wellness pathways, and they've done a lot in mental health. And I think there are other innovative, large healthcare systems that have been able to do some of that, and it just depends how you strike that balance.
Kaiser is physician run, and it's run by the ethics of physicians. They try to prevent illness. They're not interested in And one thing that might make a huge difference is just the length of insurance contracts. So if insurance company is only going to be responsible for a patient's health for a year, they're going to behave differently than if they're in there for 10 years or even 4 years. So I think one fix would just be to mandate that insurance companies have to take once they sign on a patient, it has to be for 4 years or something. Because what's happening is that they're getting in there, they're taking the profits, and then when the patients get sick, they're out of the picture. Yeah.
I think another phenomenon we have in Silicon Valley is a lot of these companies are so large, they actually self-insure. And so the insurance companies just run the billing. But now you've got companies whose expertise is in building software networks, or like Facebook, Apple, Google, all of those places self-insure. But they also realize this is a huge amount of their expenditures, and so they're actually managing healthcare at the same time.
So Deanna Fay wrote a
Memoir about having her husband working for AOL, and because it's big enough, they have their own health insurance. And then because their baby was born needing to be in an incubator, they were kind of singled out as bad employees because they had a sick baby, and his job was jeopardized. So that's the that just goes against the tenets of the medical profession and drives home how important confidentiality is too, and how vulnerable people are when they're sick. But big problem. But I think physicians and our ethics need to be at the center, or else nothing is going to work. Thanks, Fernando. Dr. Mendoza, thank you so much.
So there is the challenge for you all to make this better.
And I think each of you in this room could make it better than it is now.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.